conversations to set the stage for tonight's speaker.
Well, it is such a pleasure to see so many old friends and new in the audience. Thank you for coming out on a Tuesday night to share this event with us. As Catherine mentioned, we started Sea Change Conversation all the way back in 2014, and I did not do it alone. There were 3 other wonderful women who were with me. Carrie Dykeman, Katie Kinsolving, and Pam Mount, wherever they are. There's Katie, and there's Pam Mount. And since then, we've actually grown to a team of 13. And please indulge me while I just read out the names, because these women do so much and work at their creativity and their can do it that has made this whole initiative work. So Sophie Clothier, Harriet Brainerd, Kathy Herring, Margaret Seek, Jillian Reeder, Kim Heron, Lorraine Shara, Catherine, who you already met, and Mary Beckler. Was that 13? And when we got started way back in 2014, if you would recall, there was a spiral of silence around the issue of climate change. It wasn't talked about in the press, it wasn't talked about by the politicians. In fact, it was kind of socially unacceptable to bring it up in certain circles, in a cocktail party or a dinner party. And there was a feeling, and I think Fred is going to talk about this, that it was an environmental issue. It was something just for environmentalists, for people who were on the left edge of the spectrum. But those of us who started Sea Change saw it very differently. We saw it instead as not an environmental issue, but as a human issue, as a universal issue. And one that would not just impact the environment, but would impact the things that we care about most, which are our jobs and the economy, our health and our personal security, and our exposure to geopolitical instability, which we experience as terrorism and refugee flows and civil chaos. And we realized that our friends and colleagues and loved ones, people in this room, really weren't aware of the global nature or the universal nature of this risk. And we wondered if there was a way to bring people into the conversation, to wake people up without turning them off. And we started off with our speaker series, of which this is our 17th offering to this community. I'm so excited to have Fred here tonight. And we followed up with our second initiative, which is our primer, which I know many of you guys have heard, which is a PowerPoint that really explains the science behind climate change and puts into context how the forecast ahead could impact us and why they are a risk worth looking at with clear eyes and an open mind. And we have been fascinated to see how this message has caught on. We've now been to 25 different states. We presented it to about 5,500 different people. And wherever we go, it seems that people are eager to bring this nonpartisan, science-based, inclusive message forward. So it's been quite a ride. And again, these 13 team members have been responsible for making all of that happen. So with that, I'd like to say thank you all again for being our friends and for coming, and to thank the Sedimon Aerosols for their fabulous hospitality yet again. And Catherine is also our treasurer and head of development, so she wears many, many hats. So thank you.
Oh, did we mention that we're a 501c3? Oh, and there's a big crystal bowl out front. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce my friend Fred Rich. This is actually not the first Sedimon Aerostock that Fred has had the pleasure of discussing getting to green with. He and Andrew spoke on a Nature Conservancy panel a year or so ago, I guess, on this very topic of how do we get to green? How do we get to what Fred defines as center green? So a little bit of background on Fred. Fred was a partner at Sullivan and Cromwell for 30 years. He is an author. This is his second book. He's working on his third book. He is a Woodrow Wilson School graduate. So this is, go Tigers. This is home for him. He was looking at the new Wawa and going, like all the rest of us. Anyway, it has been a wild ride for me as, what I would classify as a moderate Republican, to see an issue that I care so much about be divided and the communication be so harsh on both sides. And so I have used, as you might tell, this has been, this is like my bedtime reading, my Bible, for green conversation. It has been really, really helpful for me to read Fred's book and to be able to understand why we have communication gaps, why we have such differences of opinion when this issue is so important. This issue of protecting our environment has been so important to everyone, to all Americans, regardless of your political stripe, for so many generations. And now it seems we are just even more divided than we were, 10 years ago. So I look forward to your feedback after you've heard Fred, and then his book, by the way, we are, for a $50 donation to Sea Change Conversations, we can give you a copy of Fred's book, and Fred might be gracious enough to autograph it for you right outside after we, in the living room after we have this. So without further ado, Fred, thank you so much for making the time to be here.
You're welcome. Well, thank you, and thanks everybody for coming. I'm really delighted to be here because, as you're going to hear, this type of event, something that's local, something that's conversational, holds the seeds of what I see as the solution to the problem that we're in. Right? And you're going to hear that message over and over. So this is really the first time I've had a chance to talk about the book in this kind of setting, right? Not a big auditorium with 500 people or on television. I did a 5-week book tour. I did, call-in talk radio in Oklahoma. You can imagine the types of questions that I got. But this is much better, and my remarks, I hope, are going to launch a true conversation, right? A real discussion that we can have afterwards. Now, this book, I gather I'm number 17. I was the 17th choice for this series. And I'm sure my book is not like any of the other ones that you heard about, because other books about climate change and the environment, what do they all start with? They all start with discussions of melting glaciers and dying coral reefs. None of that in my book. They talk about, or maybe if they're more sort of policy wonkish, is it 350 parts per million, 400, 450, what's the tipping point? Or maybe it's long chapters on which is more efficient, a carbon tax or a carbon fee. None of that's in my book. Because I think that uniquely in the area of climate change and environmentally generally, we know what the problem is. We don't need more books to tell us about the problem. You can spend 30 seconds on Google and you can find out what the problem is. We know the problem. We also know the solutions. We got a lot of problems that we face as a civilization for which we're sort of raising our hands. We don't know the solutions. Yet we know the solutions. We know what we have to do. So that's not interesting to me either. What's interesting to me is how do we find the political will to move forward and do what we need to do? It seems to me this is the essential question that we face. What is it in this country that's changing, that's preventing us from simply taking the actions which are right there in front of us to break the political gridlock and start taking some action? What is it? What's stopping us? So as an environmentalist, as somebody who has followed climate change closely for 20 years, that's the question that I sought to answer in this book. The problem with climate change does go more broadly into the environmental movement. The environmental movement is stalled. We have toxic politics around green issues, right? What passes for political debate in this country is, a debate over whether the problem is real, right, as opposed to what the debate should be, right, which is what do we do? And there's a real debate to be had. I want to make that very clear either. This is where our politicians and our thinkers and our respective ideological perspectives should come to bear. How quickly do we act? How much do we do? How much are we willing to pay, right? Those are real questions. Those are the questions we're supposed to be debating, but we're not. So why do I say that the whole environmental movement is stalled and that this problem on climate change is part of that? I just want to give you a few facts that put this in perspective. You know, at the national level, the general picture on dealing with environmental issues is extremely grim, and I'm not just talking about post-2016. Before Trump was elected, we had a US Congress that had not passed a single piece of environmental legislation for 25 years, a quarter century, right? And not a single action by our national legislature. Over that period, federal spending on environment went from 4% of the total federal budget to 1% of the total budget. On climate change, it's been the #1 priority of the environmental movement for 2 decades, right? And what's been achieved? At the national level, nothing, right? We tried cap and trade in 2003, we failed. We tried 2005, we failed. We tried 2007, we failed. But the worst was 2010. You have to study 2010 because it's so instructive. Because what did people think? They, well, you know, if only we had, you know, if only the Democrats and progressives were in control of both houses of Congress, right, everything would be right. Well, 2010, we had both houses in control of the Democrats. If only we had a president, right, who was willing to prioritize the issue and drive it through. What did we have? We had a brand new president who had made climate change as one of his top 3 priorities. If only we could get corporate support behind climate action. What did we have in 2010? We had 100 of the country's largest corporations united in a partnership supporting a market price for carbon. So all the stars were aligned, and yet the US Senate couldn't even bring Waxman-Markey to the floor of the Senate because they knew it would fail, right? So how did this happen? Why did this happen even in those circumstances? I wrote Getting to Green, if any of you are nice enough to read it or peruse it. Bear in mind it was written before 2016, before the election. But it was interesting because I was arguing that the so-called progress that had been achieved under the Obama administration was illusory. And I said, okay, you know, you've entered in the Paris Agreement, but without Senate ratification, you know, it can all be undone. It's an illusion. You've had the Clean Power Plan, but it was done through regulation. It can be reversed, right? You've had this big fight and put all your eggs in fighting the Keystone Pipeline project. And if people here were, you know, spent their money and treasure and energy doing it, I admire your instinct, but I did not agree actually with with prioritizing that project. Defeating Keystone did not move the needle on climate change one whit. And it was absolutely clear that, again, but for the more fundamental political problems, it would be reversed. And of course, what happened? We had Trump. It was all reversed. It was all an illusion. Every single bit of progress that was made on a unilateral partisan basis under Obama, every single one was undone. You know, environmentalists, we talk a lot about sustainability, right? I mean, it's sort of our touchstone, right, about how to live and how to organize society. We've got to be sustainable. But we don't think about sustainability in politics, right? Solutions that we adopt politically and legally, they're only going to work if they're sustainable. Sustainability means they'll survive a change in administration. We've had Social Security, you know, for how many years now? You know, can't do my math, 80 years, you know, that's sustainable. Things that were hugely, you know, controversial when they came in, but they were done on a basis that they could be sustained. And, you know, think of it this way. The idea that we can do something as epic as decarbonizing the American economy, you know, over the determined objections of half the citizenry is an illusion. All right? So what does this all mean? It means that you've got to address that half the citizenry. We've got to change the conversation. We've got to break out of this political deadlock. So how do we do this? Well, the first thing is to ask, well, how do we get here in the first place? And you know, you all are aware that a lot of this results from, you know, the rise of movement conservatism in the mid-90s. And the choice of anti-environmentalism and climate denial to become a kind of core marker or article of faith for the conservative point of view. And this has had a very profound effect over a very short period of time on the attitudes of the right. And you have to understand that this changes. So today, there's a series of Pew polls that measure partisan division. You may have read the polls or you see them in the papers when they come out. And it's how far apart the two parties are on a range of issues. Do you know that today environment is number 2? In other words, Republicans and Democrats in these polls disagree most on, first, the scope of the social safety net. That comes in number 1. Second is environment. But just think about that. They disagree about environment more than they disagree about taxation, immigration, role of government, regulation, religiosity. Right? How did we get there? Imagine this. In 1992, those same people in the poll who were self-described Republicans, 86% of the Republicans said there needed to be stricter environmental regulation. Right? That's 1992. 10 years later, that number was cut in half, and now it's lower. Right? So this change, right, is of a fairly recent origin. And so the book goes much more deeply into this question of how this hostility on the right to both climate and environment, how did it arise and what can be done about it? And one of the things that I do, especially with college audiences, I mean, the average age of this audience is a little higher than the normal college audience that I get sometime, but you probably know this. But I say to the college audiences that today we have, if any of you know about environmental law, we have 9 federal statutes that make up the basic framework of environmental law. 9 of them. I looked back at those 9 laws to see what happened when they came through the Congress and what sort of support they had from Republicans. I found out that of the 9 environmental laws that were passed during the 70s and 80s that are still on the books, 100% of Republicans in the Senate voted for every one. The vote in the House of Representatives, 60 to 85% of GOP House members supported each of those bills. Right? Now, it was very funny. The college audiences, you're not doing this. They all pull out their phone and start going like this to see if I'm right, because they can't believe that I'm right. I tell them that Richard Nixon created the EPA on his own initiative, because the narrative they hear about what happened in Congress and they say, yeah, but that must have been the Republicans going along, right, because the left was leading. No, they weren't going along. There was vigorous leadership on environmental issues from the right. Nixon is a very interesting case. I mean, we all know Nixon was no nature lover, right? But he was a very savvy politician. And if you read Nixon's private writings and diaries, it's fascinating. He was terrified that the Democrats and the left would get out front on environment. Terrified. He saw environmental issues as issues that transcended class, that transcended party. And very interestingly, he saw environment as something that would heal the wounds of the nation at that time. Nixon was very concerned about the divisions that had opened up in our country after the civil rights movement and then very freshly as a result of Vietnam. And he believed that environment could heal these wounds. This is, and finally I would just note for those of you who are thinking, oh yeah, well that must have been all those sort of establishment Republicans like Andrew's father and, Bill Ruckelshaus and Bill Riley and so forth. Did you know that Barry Goldwater was a member of the Sierra Club? All right? So what I'm trying to point out is that we had a functioning bipartisan consensus in the 70s and 80s that resulted in our responding to very significant and difficult environmental challenges at the time. And I don't just mean dirty air and dirty water and all the stuff, the rivers on fire, what's basically viewed as that sort of first phase of most obvious environmental problems. It also included things like sulfur dioxide and acid rain. right? It was something that needed the intermediation of science to deal with, right? And the, cap and trade was invented by Republicans as a way to efficiently allocate the reductions in sulfur dioxide emissions to solve acid rain. So this was something that was very real, and it worked. So how did we lose it? I don't have time, but in the book, there's a lot of interesting scholarship about that. And there's one thing in particular I'll just tell you so you get a flavor for what this scholarship looks like. It was a study done at Harvard, and I can't imagine the unlucky graduate students. They were sent off into some room in a basement to watch 5 years of Fox News coverage on climate change. And they scored every single Fox News report on a 5-point scale from, what was the message, the core message of this report, from just sort of straightforward reporting at one end to, climate change is a hoax on the other end. They then took the same period and looked in detail at all the Pew polling of registered Republican voters, and then tried to correlate the two curves. And what came out was absolutely remarkable. Just to give you the numbers, in 2006, only 50% of the Fox coverage of climate was on a denialist or hoax theme. There was a pivot in 2006, and thus it had been, for years and years before. In 2006, there was a decision to change. They pivoted. In the next 3 years, that 50% became 90%. Right? So over 3 years, you went from 50% denialist coverage on Fox to 90% denialist coverage. If you correlate the registered Republican voters who said that there was no solid evidence for global warming, in the first year, 2006, it was 30%. And when the Fox coverage doubled from 50 to 90, nearly doubled, that number of denialist sentiment among registered Republicans doubled from 30% to 60%. And the correlation is almost month to month. Now, obviously, it's simplistic. There are social media bubbles, and there are a lot of other factors. But the key thing to know here is that this was not a bottoms-up phenomenon. It's not that Republicans and conservatives woke up one morning and said, we don't care about clean air and clean water. This was a tactical move on the part of the leaders of movement conservatism, who saw the value that environment and climate especially would have as a wedge issue in mobilizing their base. Now, lest you think that I sort of blame this whole separation, which I call the great estrangement, that I blame it all on the right, I don't, because there were some very interesting other factors at play. At the same time that movement conservatism was drifting to this new hard right stance on environment and climate, the environmental movement itself was drifting further to the left. And over this same period, when conservative commentators said, all those Greens, all they do is care about, animals, and they don't care about jobs, and basically their agenda is bad for the economy. On one hand, they were engaging in a very cynical tactic of setting up this dichotomy between environment and economy, and we all know now it's a false dichotomy, but it was politically very powerful. But the origins of that false dichotomy came out of the Green movement itself. So Tom and I were in the class of 77, and I don't know whether you were taking, Tom, reading the same books that I was, but I was reading, Barry Commoner and Paul Ehrlich, right? Think of the 60s and 70s. And does anybody remember the IPAT formula? IPAT. I, which is environmental impact, equals P, population, times A, affluence, times T, technology, right? So the environmental movement said that what's bad for the planet is people, wealth, and technology, right? This is not exactly a winner politically in the late 20th and early 21st century. And lest you think that that kind of thinking was confined to the origins of the environmental movement. How many people here read Naomi Klein's This Changes Everything about climate? It was the #1 best-selling book on environmental policy in Amazon, I'm happy to say, before my book came along. But it's even more stark. Naomi Klein said that the continuance of the capitalist system and the continuation of global corporate capitalism is inconsistent with the survival of the planet due to global warming, and that anybody who's serious about, and what she said, ironically, she said, they're right. When Rush Limbaugh says that, you can't solve climate change, right, without throwing out capitalism and corporate structures and losing your job, Naomi Klein, from the perspective of the left, says they're right. They're right. This changes everything, right? And lest you think, now she's a very radical left Canadian journalist, but it's not just her. These voices that you hear out of the environmental movement, all right, they're not isolated. Many of you here probably knew Gus Speth, who was the dean of Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. Scott, you're great guy, great hero, one of my heroes, right? Wrote a lot of books. I don't know if you read his last book. His last book said what Naomi Klein's book said. We got to throw out capitalism. We got to throw out, the corporate form because the planet won't survive. So this is also part of the issue, that there are these voices in the environmental movement, that they're real. So we have this great estrangement. So what's the problem? One of the problems was that my colleagues in the environmental movement seemed to think that it really didn't matter. The fact that you lost 50% of the American population, right, lost their support and participation, didn't matter because the agenda could be carried out unilaterally, right, by the left when they were in control. And that was a terrible mistake because it's dead wrong. If you look at the history of the United States, we have never made progress on any environmental issue other than on a bipartisan basis. Never. There's not a single example. And the only example that came up was what Obama did, admittedly, after he tried to get it through Congress. I mean, it's not that that was his predisposition, but he tried to do it unilaterally, and it didn't survive 4 years. So what I hope I'm trying to convince you is that some limited restoration of this space in which the two sides can work together is absolutely necessary to making progress on climate change. The question is it possible? I mean, I usually get a lot of shaking heads when I assert that it's necessary. And then when I ask, you think it's possible, people are sort of staring at their shoes and, not so convinced. So let me just tell you a couple reasons why I think it is possible. First of all, we now have learned that our minds work in such a way that we always think that the current political environment is somehow permanent. It's part of the permanent landscape, right? We can't imagine a world, right, in which the divisions and conversations that that aren't happening today, that it's different. But history teaches us that the political landscape, the fundamental shifts in the political landscape, not only happen, they're absolutely inevitable. And just think of a few examples. I mean, when I was young, and many of you were young, Congress was filled with conservative Democrats from the South, right? I mean, you couldn't talk about American politics without that iceberg that was a huge force in American politics and always had been. They're gone. It doesn't exist anymore. Just up in a puff of smoke, 30 years. Think of, when I was born, you couldn't imagine an America without segregation, right? We've had an African-American president. Or even in the shorter term, think of 2010. In 2010, you looked at the prospects for marriage equality, for gay marriage. It seemed absolutely hopeless. And yet within 2 years, we had a complete sea change politically and kind of morally in the country. And a tipping point was reached and something very dramatic happened. And it's very interesting when I talk to many GOP senators, many of them raise the marriage equality example as an illustration of how quickly that tipping point can be reached. So if you accept for me that these tipping points happen and are possible, and this kind of change is possible, how do we make it happen? And I don't have time to go into this in great detail, but there are basically 3 steps in getting to green. And the first is we've got to reconnect conservatives with the parts of conservative ideology which make environmentalism and climate action mandatory. It's not optional, right? I review the sort of history of conservative thought, stewardship, responsibility, intergenerational equity. These are deeply conservative ideas, right? And they mandate environmental action. In contrast, there's nothing remotely conservative about the idea that it's okay to trash the planet now to make a marginal buck. There's nothing conservative in that idea. So there is this deep cognitive dissonance, all right, between the underlying sort of ideology of traditional conservatism and what we're hearing today. Moreover, we have tens of millions of self-identified conservatives and Republicans in this country who are deeply connected with nature and the natural world. We have tens of millions still involved with Sportsman's Group and Nature's, Trout Unlimited and Isaac Walton League. Take National Audubon. I find this fascinating, right? National Audubon did a survey. 40% of their members self-identify as Republican or conservative, 40%. And I'm sure many of you are members or affiliated with Audubon in some way. You'd be aware that 3 or 4 years ago, when they had a major change in leadership, they adopted a new strategic plan, and they went from a place where they wouldn't even write the words climate change in the magazine, right, for fear of alienating the 40% of their members, to putting climate change at the center of their new strategic plan, right there on the cover. The impact of a changing planet on bird migration, all of our work is going to be aligned along this. And I had lunch with the president of Audubon a few months ago. He said that there was no appreciable loss of their conservative and Republican members when they did that. It's true that this idea of climate denialism is what political scientists call sticky. You heard this word in political science. Sticky views are views that were not derived from the facts through the exercise of reason. You didn't say, oh, what should be my opinion on, global warming? Well, I'll just do some research and I'll look at the facts and I'll make an analysis and then I'll have my position. No, that's not where the opinions come from. These sticky opinions come as a consequence of a decision you make about your identity. You decide, I'm a patriot, I'm a conservative, I'm a Republican, I'm a Texan, I'm this, I'm that. I have this is my identity, this is who I am, right? And then we assume with that identity the sort of baggage that goes along with it, right? And this is one of those. This is one of those views. This is we were talking earlier about Jonathan Haidt, and I'm sure you've read Dan Kahan and Dan Kahneman, what they call cultural cognition, motivated reasoning. We now really are starting to understand where people's moral and political views come from. So this really helps explain this sort of seeming blindness or indifference to the facts, and it deeply informs those like you who are trying to engage in communications about climate change. The good news is that what all this science tells us is that these sticky views can be changed, but they require leadership from the identity group that holds them, not from the outside. So if you're there in Texas and you're I'm a Christian patriot, Texas person, and you see the Al Gore slide, it almost probably has never changed a single heart or mind, even though the science is good and the graphs are great and the communication is highly honed by consultants, right? But in contrast, when someone from within the group starts to suggests that maybe the group's position on the issue should change. It's very different. And I just want to make sure that everybody here knows the story about Bob Inglis. Does everybody? Have you had Bob Inglis to speak or not?
No, not yet.
So just for those who don't know, it's too good. I'll just very briefly tell you the story of Bob Inglis. Bob Inglis was a 6-term congressman representing the most conservative district in South Carolina. He is an evangelical Christian. He was a self-declared member of the Tea Party. He was 6 terms, and 1 year rolled around, and there was a congressional junket, and they were going to Antarctica with 6 or 8 of the country's leading climate scientists, and they needed a Republican. So Bob said, well, I'll go. It's a junket to Antarctica. When he came back, he stood up in the pulpit of a church in his district, and he said, folks, we got this one wrong. I just come back from Antarctica, and man, my God, it's all melting, and I was with these scientists, and it's all going to hell, and we got to change. But he did that for about 30 seconds on the getting it wrong thing. But then what he spent the whole rest of the time saying is, as a Christian, as a father, when I look inside myself and ask what my values require me to do, my values require me to act. I can't ignore this, right? This is what a good Christian would do in these circumstances. In other words, he spoke the language of value. Now, there's sort of good news, bad news in this story. The bad news is he was primaried from the right because he had committed apostasy and he lost his seat. The good news is that he didn't just go off into the sunset. He got into his car and he started driving all around the South to Christian colleges and churches and anybody who would listen to him, and started to tell the story of the changing climate and global warming and what it would mean, but in his language, in their language, right, from a place where it was a moral issue. He didn't invoke scientists, he invoked morality. This is a moral issue. You have to look inside yourself and decide who you are and whether you need to act, right? What will future generations see when they look back and they saw that you were willfully blind? What will that tell them about the type of person that your ancestor was? And 2 or 3 years later, the Kennedy Library in Boston gave him the John F. Kennedy Profiles in Courage Award. And if you really want to be reminded about what America could be, just go online and read the remarks that the Kennedy family made. And here you had this evangelical conservative standing in the heart of the liberal establishment in Boston. And they were coming together over the changing climate and the moral case for making it, right? That's the sort of essence, that moment shows us what we can do and where we can be. I want to read you one thing. We were talking about voices, and because this is about conversations, and how we say it and what we say is really, how we say it is as important as what we say. I just want to read to you what the Evangelical Climate Initiative said, and this is in the book after I have a long series of dreadful, dire, dry statements from environmental organizations about, trying to scare the bejesus of everybody about climate change. And the Evangelical Climate Initiative came in and put out a press release, and they said, human activity is increasing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and the impacts on God's creation and his people will be tragic. To ignore this is unthinkable. To grasp the problem with faith and courage, and with the wind of American ingenuity and goodness at our back, is morally right and, in our view, faithful to our Creator God. One sentence, right? Look at the vividness of that language. It invokes patriotism, our American sense of self, American ingenuity, American goodness, right? This is how to make the case for climate change with our fellow citizens who today hold a different view. I just want to say a couple other things quickly about other things that have to change in order to bring this home. One is the demographics of the movement of people who care about this. And I'm very sorry to say, looking around this room, I see an audience that is largely white, largely upper middle class, largely over 50, and I'm being a little generous there. In contrast, today more than half of our country lives in cities. By 1950, half will be non-white. I have a question for you. What do you think the average age of members of the Nature Conservancy was in 2012? Anybody want to guess? What?
70?
Average age. Yeah. 62. And you know what's interesting? 2012, you know who those people are who are 62 and 2012? They were the people who were 20 on the first Earth Day in 1970. It's the same people. It's been the same people for the whole, the whole bulk of the century, right? This is go boomers, right? This is a disaster. The other disaster is we need to change the political clout of this movement. Where does political clout? We are, for the time being, still a democracy, right? The sentiments of people and their willingness to express them, not just through voting, but in other ways, matters. Does anybody want to guess how many people participated in the first Earth Day in 1970? 20 million. And do you know what the first Earth Day was in 1970? It wasn't some big nationally sponsored rally. It was this. Yeah. It was, we used to call them in the 60s, teach-ins. Right. And they were conversations. They were local, small conversations, right? This very loose structure. Paul McCloskey, a Republican senator, I forget who the Democrat was. Gaylord Nelson, thank you. Completely bipartisan, very loose leadership from the top. A mass movement. We couldn't get 200,000 people to turn out.
Hayes.
Sorry?
Dennis Hayes.
It was
His idea, right.
He did it every year, every 10 years.
Right. So we couldn't get 200,000 to turn out 3 years ago for the climate march. We became a movement of specialists, of policy specialists. We became, it was as the college campuses like to say now, white guys in suits inside the Beltway. They were working an inside game. We lost it. Do you know that the night that they had to decide whether to bring Wax and Markey onto the floor of the Senate, the majority leader, who was it at the time? I'm blanking. 2010 majority leader of the Senate. Yeah. He stood at his window, which overlooked the steps of the Capitol building. He was looking out. There was nobody there. He turned around and he said, "Where are the college students? Where is everybody? Right? Where is the political support for this thing that we're being asked to do, this nearly impossible thing?" It wasn't there. The environmental movement had lost that energy of a mass grassroots movement. That's why I think what Kathleen and all of you are doing in these peer-to-peer conversations is so powerful. And finally, we need a change in tactics. We have been trying to sell the apocalypse, right, for 40 years. Think of 1963. Martin Luther King stood up and he said, I have a dream. And within 40 years, we had an African-American president. At the same time, the environmentalists stood up and said, we have a nightmare. Right? And we didn't offer the positive vision. I mean, think of the rest of Martin Luther King's speech. It wasn't about the disaster for both white and black people in the country at that time. It was a vision, right? I dream that my children will be judged by the content of their character. It was a vision. It was a positive vision. He was selling, if we go here, this is what life will be like. Environmentalists never painted a picture of what the destination was. And in climate change, right? I'm not saying we should be Pollyanna-ish. Obviously, we have to describe, the disasters that we face, but that's not enough to motivate people. We have to have a vision. What is it like when we get there? If we do these things, where do we arrive, and what does it look like, and why is it a hopeful, marvelous place to be in which, we have greater health and greater freedom and greater security and all those things that will follow from following the prescriptions that we need. So we need a vision of hope. So it's very hot, and I want to start our conversation. So let me just say at the end, even if you don't buy sort of anything I said being hopeful, and I have many more examples of sort of leadership from the right, the Pope's encyclical, and things that are happening on the Hill. I hope you all read about Lamar Alexander's response to the Green New Deal. Absolutely fascinating. Republican from Tennessee. He said last week, basically, okay, there's the Green New Deal. This is the moment when we on the right have to show leadership, right? If not that, then what? If not that, then what? And he put out this thing it's called like the New Manhattan Project, and we were talking about it because it has nuclear playing a key role in the transition to an all-renewable future. And I can tell you from my travels around the country and my discussions with many conservative groups, it's a key litmus test on how seriously you take climate change. If you try to tell them, right, the global warming is the number one problem faced by human civilization, and then 30 seconds later say, yeah, but I don't want any nuclear, right? They find a real dissonance in that. And of course, it very much divides the environmental movement, and Lamar Alexander, I think, has done something very clever tactically in putting that out there. So let me just say one other thing. Even if you don't believe that all these signs are hopeful, at the end of the day, political parties do what they need to do to win elections. So forget doing the right thing, forget the moral imperative, right? Let's just look at this from a pure political perspective. I don't often, agree with Karl Rove, but he said in 2008 and again in 2012 that the usefulness of climate ridicule to, mobilize the base on the right had been completely outweighed by the fact that it completely alienates swing voters, the young, the non-whites, all the demographics that you need to win a national election in the 21st century. Karl Rove was there already by 2008 and 2012. He warned that a key litmus test for whether a new center-right party could emerge and actually lead in this country was whether they could show engagement and leadership in climate change and green issues. This is Karl Rove, all right? Now, it all got blown out of the water, of course, by Trumpism, but every demagogic populist movement, eventually collapses from, it disappoints its supporters, it collapses from its own contradictions. We've got to keep our eye on the horizon. What comes after? And it's a moment when we can have one of these pivots, the conversation can change, and we really can move forward. And the very last thought I want to leave you with is about these conversations and these types of meetings. You're doing two things in what you do, Kathleen, with your colleagues. You're helping move the needle on public attitudes toward global warming and climate change, but you're also helping heal the divides in the country, because what we need most is for people from both sides to talk to each other. That act of talking is an act of healing, and I see this in the land trust movement, in which I'm very involved, that if you can keep it local, and you can keep it small, and you can keep it peer-to-peer, you have a basis for understanding, you start to build bridges. I actually think climate change will swing from a dividing wedge issue to a great unifier as we work together to meet this problem. So I'm an optimist. So let's have our conversation.
Questions?
I haven't read your book yet, I definitely will, but I heard that the fossil fuel industry gave over $1 billion to political entities in fighting climate change, and I
Um, I would say a couple things about that. Yes, it's true. I mean, a lot of money has poured into this. That is changing. You don't have that kind of money coming from the oil majors the way you did 5 or 10 years ago. It's still coming from the Koch brothers. It's coming from small shale players and so forth. And second, the other side has managed to $1 billion isn't what it used to be. I mean, we have a number of private equity guys and hedge fund managers and young tech billionaires who are absolutely prepared to write checks of the same size. And I think in this cycle, you're going to start to see more and more of it. There is a function. A lot of money that had poured into political action for conservation, environment, and climate change has gotten a little distracted with things like trying to save our democracy and freedom of the press. And I raise money for a lot of environmental organizations, and a lot of people I go to talk to say, well, yeah, I'm a true believer, but I'm off trying to work these other priorities. But no, I think the playing field will get more equal. But you're right. It's a problem. Money is speech now under our law, and it's protected. And if you want to counter it, you got to raise equal amounts of money.
So you talked about the correlation, if not the causation, with Fox News in terms of the numbers. In addition to the solution that you're saying is proposed by things like this in this room, do you feel like there's actually a possibility for a media shift in the other direction or a solution there?
Well, I don't think you do. I think what history, in my opinion, when history is written, we're still too much in it to have great clarity and perspective. I think Fox News is something absolutely unique and different in the history of world politics, and certainly in American history. We've always had papers that were partisan and media outlets that are partisan. Look at the UK, there's nothing new about that. But one that had such a grip on the attention and was so successful in leading the views of such a large segment of the population, my view is something very, very new. But it's not just that. It's the rise of the media bubbles that we all start to live in, these bubbles, these online bubbles, these social media bubbles that simply reinforce. They do the opposite of what we're all trying to do here, what I advocate that we need to do, which is to open our eyes and ears and hearts and listen to people on the other side and try to discuss this from common ground, not different ground. That's not how you spend your day. You spend your day on the device with all your prejudices being reconfirmed because we all live in these bubbles of common belief. How do you break through that? We have very few independent media sources that penetrate both sides that are left. I mean, PBS, I just held a huge fundraiser for PBS NewsHour. I think Judy Woodruff and her team, I think they're heroic because they're giving it straight. And by the way, the amount of time they spend on climate change is more than any other national news program that exists. Right? It's something, I forget what the statistic is, it's amazing. But I don't know how to solve that problem other than to keep those independent media sources alive, and if you just posit that you can't break through those tight reinforcing circles through social media or regular media, one way you can do it is personally. You do it sitting around the kitchen table. I mean, I work on conservation projects in Wyoming with the Tea Party senators from Wyoming, and when you're sitting at the table having coffee discussing how to save the ranch, they cease to be this abstraction, these Tea Party, Wild West, hyper conservatives, and they become people, and you actually start to have conversations. So that's why I say I'm afraid that the mechanisms for national conversation are kind of broken. So what do? I think we have to have different types of conversations. I shouldn't be picking on these people. Somebody else should pick who speaks. Yes, sir.
So that leads into the thought I had is we have institutionalized conflict. And what I tell my students as I teach at Rutgers is that fire breathers can only draw an audience when they're breathing fire. And if they stop, the audience walks away.
That's right.
At which point their income is gone, their cause is dead. So that's a major thing that we have to break through somehow. It used to be that the fire breathers, what we all hated was polluters, right? So we had right and left, Republicans, Democrats, all aimed at the polluters. Now it's more nuanced.
It is more nuanced, but you know, it's interesting. I think interestingly, what we now understand is that the power that we have to wield that is perhaps most valuable in today's world is our attention. Our attention has become the commodity. It's not our vote, it's our attention. The economy runs on it. Whoever can get it gets rewarded. And you know what? You have the power, right? You can sit and say, you know, I'm not going to spend 4 hours today making money for Mark Zuckerberg. I'm not going to do it. I'm going to turn my attention elsewhere, you know? I'm going to read a book. I'm going to have a conversation, right? I'm going to seek out, you know, something else. So I think that we have to become much more conscious of that new world. That, you know, we can't be passive. I mean, you're either somebody whose attention is commoditized, and as you say, the loudest person who screams gets it, or you're a responsible person exercising free will, and you're deliberate about where you give your attention.
Go ahead, Tom.
It's good to see you. This is first time I apologize. I didn't do the reading before class, but I definitely want to buy the book. I've always had a formulation, Fred, in my head, you know, it's not scientific, that voting was a function of direct and immediate. So in other words, in the Vietnam era, we nominated McGovern because 20-year-olds were directly and immediately affected.
Right.
You know, I'd argue in the last congressional cycle, people were motivated. It was direct and immediate. We can blunt Trump if you're so inclined. I would argue that even the gay marriage thing was direct and immediate enough. Contrast that with Social Security. Talk to a 20-year-old about Social Security. Forget it. It's not really direct. It's not really immediate. And so the issue here is just play devil's advocate a little bit. How do you make global warming something that is direct and something that's immediate? Because I think in the minds of a lot of people, it is, well, this is something that affects my grandkids. Good luck to them. And you know, it's 40 years off in the minds of some, which I think is nonsense. But how do you combat that if you accept my formulation or my premise?
Right. You know what does that job is, you know, Superstorm Sandy, is all your friends losing their house in a wildfire, your condo in Miami Beach is underwater all the time. You know, we found in it's really interesting, hard right areas that are affected by climate-related catastrophe leap over the question of whether climate change is real. They leap over it, and they're very willing to engage in a what do we do now, right? Andrew and I were on the board of a environmental group in the Hudson Valley, and we had been trying to get communities to prepare for sea level rise for a long time. We sent out our scientist. He was trained in the best science communication. He failed, you know, nobody wanted to deal with it. And then we had Irene and Superstorm Sandy, two, you know, 500-year storms within a year of each other. All these waterfront cities were underwater. People suffered damage. We didn't go in, and here was the key for communication. We didn't go in and say, "Ah, you see, you were wrong." Yeah, just went in and said, "Okay, let's convene everybody. What are we going to do about this? We face this new reality. How do we want to handle it?" So I think that it's interesting. In the old days, talking about adaptation was a big no-no because the climate zealots believed that if you even allowed a conversation to happen about adaptation, you were taking your eye off mitigation, and mitigation was the key. Those days are over because we know that there's a certain amount of change that is unmitigable, at least not in, you know, this century. So I think that's part of the answer, Tom. I mean, and all I can say is, there are two things. I agree. There's the direct and immediate point, and then there's the question about, can we really deal with problems that require the intermediation of science as opposed to problems which are obvious? Maybe it's part of your direct and immediate. And many people who look at the history of the environmental movement say, okay, they divide it into the three classes: the first order, second order, and third order problems. I don't know if anybody know this scheme. First order problems was, the river's on fire, you can't drink the water, the sky is black, you put out your sheets, they turn black. I mean, just direct, immediate, obvious. You don't need a scientist to tell you, right? You can't do it. First order problems, right? Second order problems were more different because they did require toxics. If you kind of think about the history of the environmental movement, right? A little bit more remote. So you mean the stuff in the food is really killing me, and God, thalidomide, who knew? I mean, we went from that sort of 50s and 60s great faith in the government to suddenly this understanding that toxics were real and they were affecting our health. A little more difficult, but we got through that. And then the third order were things that were both non-obvious and far away. But they included things like the hole in the ozone layer, which, do you know who gets the credit for closing the hole in the ozone layer? Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. Then you have acid rain. Now, acid rain, if you were a fisherman or you were a forester up, you saw the effects of it. But if you were an ordinary citizen, you didn't do it. But again, Bill Ruckelshaus, Bill Riley, George H.W. Bush, it required, coordinated action, and the problem was solved. So there's a history of actually being able to act on these third-order problems, even though they're remote in time and not so immediate. Good. You be the caller on, please.
So first, let me say you put me through some PTSD. Despite that, I think I will buy your book. So I've been a not just a card carrying, but an employed environmentalist for almost 30 years. And the first 15 years of my career were working for 3 different national environmental organizations in Washington, so between 1990 and 2005. So what you described, that was my world. And I can tell you, Fox News, when I went on Fox News in the early to mid-90s, and I took a good shot at a API, American Petroleum Institute guy, the host gave me an attaboy for sticking to the API.
Right.
Fast forward, the last time I was on, 2004, I was on Canada.
Right.
And he was throwing fastballs at my head on fire.
Right.
So the political world has just become such a blood sport. And there's so many professionals involved that know how to divide. I mean, the other thing, so I was a lobbyist. I was a Washington, D.C. lobbyist. And at the beginning and medium part of my career there, it was a fun job. Because we could get 8 to 10 Republicans in the Senate. We could lose 30 Democrats in the House. We could get 60. I don't know what a lobbyist does anymore on the environmental side. But that divide you talk about, not just on the right, but on the left. The other thing that happened during my 15 years there, and came to life during the debate on the Waxman-Markey bill, was on the left, this ferocity of internal competition. So, we would be advocating a bill, and the toughest opposition, the nastiest stuff was coming from our left, not our right. And that's happened on both sides. So it's a wonder they can't even agree to the Pledge of Allegiance. So what I'm curious, as a student of politics now, we had that kind of, for some, a very cleansing election now, a year or so ago. What do you predict in this next, not the presidential election, that's its own thing, but at the congressional level? Are we going to see now, with Republicans wiped out a lot of seats and trying to gain new traction, are we going to see a different kind of Republican running that may espouse different views on things like climate change and environment? Or do you think we're just stuck in the trenches for another decade?
What's your crystal ball?
Look, I don't want to put any timing on it. In due course, that's why I quoted Karl Rove at the end. At some point, right, if there is some kind of center-right party that emerges from the ashes of Trumpism, we know what it needs to do to contest national elections in the 21st century. So yes, eventually there will be a new type of, I don't know whether they'll call them what they'll call them, but they'll be there, absolutely. Whether it happens this year or not, I have no idea. The problem is when there are so many other things, environment falls to the bottom of the list. Polling, well, you were an environmentalist all your life. There are those Pew polls that say that, do you care about these things? 80% of Americans say they care about clean air and water. Every year, over and over and over, they care about clean air and water. Now, the average environmentalist then goes up to the Hill and says, see, everybody's an environmentalist. 80% of people care about it. They don't go to the next page of the Pew poll, which asks them to rank the things that they care about in order. Where do you think of the 16 things that are ranked in that Pew poll environment has come? 16, right? It doesn't even begin to compete with your job and your money and your kids' education and your health care, right? So this is why the environmental movement is broad but not deep. Everybody cares, but they don't care enough to prioritize it. Climate change should have changed that because it's such an existential threat, and it may, in due time, change that. I think it has the prospect of changing it, but again, when this whole other agenda, like the survival of our democracy and freedom of the press, and you have all these other things that are in play, I don't see a lot of people going to the polls in 2020 prioritizing environment in general. I do see a number of young people going prioritizing climate change and global warming in particular, because they're not affected by our cynicism, right? Our whole generation, for 20 years, people have said, we have 2 years to solve this problem, and then 2 years, we have 3 years to solve this problem. We don't do anything the next 3. This has been going on for 20 years, right? And we're all still here. They're not infected by that. I'm pointing to you, you're the youngest person I see. They're not affected by that problem. They take it on face value. My God, this is like a problem. We got to solve it, right? It's a really important problem, so I'm going to prioritize it. So yes, I do think that you're going to see, and there's really interesting micro-polling that Karl Rove study that I referred to. He did micro-polling district by district to really drill down into those numbers. It's really astonishing. The number who did prioritize environment on a district by district basis, okay? It was not enough to, in the present time, flip the seat, but it was growing. And so, yes, my answer is yes, but I can't tell you when.
So I am in the nonprofit world, and we talk a lot about helping people become the hero of, our family story. So we deal with homelessness, and we try to give them a tangible way that they can feel that they are the hero in that family's life, and we found that that's incredibly effective. Mm-hmm. Can you recreate that sort of scenario in the world of climate change in order to help people feel like they are the hero, in that story in which climate change is, affecting all of us? And if so, what would that look like?
Well, yes, but what would that look like? You're going to tell us. I mean, one of the beautiful things about I shouldn't say beautiful, there's very little beautiful about climate change, but one of the things that's interesting and has embedded in it so much opportunity is there's more than one path to passionate engagement with the changing climate. Don't think that everybody else has to walk your path. Some people come to it because they're obsessed with wildlife and habitat. I mean, think of the Auduboners. I mean, the impact on birds and bird migration, right? They come to it through that way. Other people are obsessed with, oceans and coral reef. Other people are city planners who realize they're obsessed because their coastal cities are going underwater. Other people simply see it as a moral issue. It's like one of those great moments. There's that great Natalie Merchant's song, you know, which side are you on, boys, right? They see it as one of those few moments, sort of in history, you've got to take a side here. This is big. You know, you're going to be judged. Take a side, right? Some people come to it with that sort of sense of imposed kind of moral responsibility on themselves. People come to it through food. We were talking earlier about Brooklyn. You know, I do this with like hipster butchers in Brooklyn. You know, they see this through the lens of fresh local food and cities. You know, the environmental movement was for too long sort of asked people to sign up to a whole sort of agenda and to care about things for the same reason that they cared about, and that was a mistake. We got to, anybody who comes to this party, we don't care how they get here. But if they're willing to join and they're willing to act and they're willing to care, they have to be embraced, they have to welcome. Look at creation care. I mean, I've had audiences where they start from a, you know, theological premise that is foreign to me. It doesn't move me at all. But it moves them to passionate action. Well, that's fabulous. So, yes, you know, your hero psychology, let's find a way to work that in. Some people will be mobilized by it. Not everybody, but some will. And that's why it's not one size fits all.
Just a follow-up question. As you probably have recognized, I'm from that younger demographic. And I think a lot of us, you know, see with the environmental movement and climate change that a way to make a difference is through investments, is through, you know, giving money to certain causes or, you know, R&D, whatever it may be. And so some of us feel, you know, we can turn the lights off, recycle, stuff like that, and make a little difference, but maybe we don't have the political power yet or the monetary power to make a difference. Is there something that you've seen amongst millennials or the younger professionals that we can do to mobilize and really feel that we're making a difference and a part of this movement?
Yes, I mean, but you know, it's getting comfortable with political action and collective action. I don't want to make terrible generalizations about your generation, but I'm going to proceed to do it because I'll give you an example. It was a big college audience once, and I said, you know, put your hand up if you care about, you know, clean air, clean water, you know, and the sort of future of the planet. You know, 80% of the hands went up. Then I said, put your hand up if you consider yourself to be an environmentalist. 20% of the hands went up. Then I said, put your hands up if you belong to or have worked with any kind of organization, right, to advance something that you believe in climate and nature. About 5% of the hands went up, right? Now then what I did is I had taken mental notes of whose hands were up and down in different stages, and then I would sort of turn to the person and say, you raised your hand and said you care, but you didn't raise your hand when I asked, and I just asked the person in the audience, I said, why? And the answers that I got was really interesting. The prevailing answers were, I don't do labels. I don't like to be labeled. Right? Don't put a label. An environmentalist, like my dad, you know, called himself an environmentalist, right? Why did you join a group? Oh, they don't do any good. They didn't do any good. Look at, I mean, it's, look at, we do nothing on climate. We do nothing on climate change. Nothing ever happens. Nothing ever changes. So why would I do that? It's a waste of my time and money. So what I, encountered, and then the example, I said, so what do you propose? And they came back to where you answered, what can I do by myself, right? I want to do something by myself. We cannot solve global warming by ourselves. I mean, yes, you can drive a Prius, and yes, you can do all that good stuff. There's nothing new in that, but that's not going to solve the problem. It requires collective action, and it requires, I wish you could, speak, Joseph, and talk about what you're doing. That's the model. That's what you should do, right? You should get the energy and engagement and lack of cynicism of young people together and insist that their politicians do better. I mean, just call them to account, right? Tell them that, you just call them to account. This is my life we're talking about, right? This is, my retirement, my age. What are you doing about this problem? So, but that you have to do in some kind of collective form, in my opinion.
I'm intrigued by your experimental rooftop gardens
Yes.
on the leaf building
Yes.
in Manhattan.
Yes.
Comment on that, because that's something you're doing.
Well, there's that you've just undercut my previous point, and you're completely right. You're completely right. So you're oh, thank you. You're right. I am personally, without any companions, doing a demonstration project in New York City. I live in the New York City's first LEED Platinum condo. You know, LEED is the green architecture condo, and it came with a green roof, and I wanted to show that you can actually ramp up a green roof and do extraordinary things in terms of biodiversity and food, because I think food is a part of the equation here. So I actually, half of it is devoted as habitat for insects, we're pollinators, half is for growing food, and we study it scientifically. We study the carbon capture from my little piece of roof. We study the biodiversity. I have 23 species of wild bees inhabiting. This is in the middle of Wall Street overlooking New York Harbor. And I'm kind of off the grid food-wise and have my own solar panels. So yeah, you just undercut my whole point. So that's what we all need to do. That's what we need to do.
All right, I just want to comment. My youngest daughter is enthralled with Cape Town, South Africa, and when she went there, they were facing a huge drought where the state was about, as of April 16th a year ago, they were going to take over everyone's water in a water barrel. I will tell you, she's still restaurants. If it's yellow, let it mellow. I mean, it was we were there for Thanksgiving. I mean, when you go to those kind of situations, you realize this could be all our future. That we're going to be, there are going to be water wars. So, seems like the Northeast actually is like more the flooding zone, but the rest of the country. So can you address about just the global issue of climate change?
You know, the cruel thing about climate change, among many other things, is that it's going to hit the poor and the vulnerable most heavily. I just came back from India. I was in Sri Lanka, I was in the Maldives, I've been in Bangladesh, been all over Southeast Asia. There's no adaptation, there's no survival. And that's a fact. You know, if you are looking for ammunition to motivate yourself, it provides very powerful ammunition. There's a I'll give you an example. In the Maldives, the former prime minister started to buy land on the east coast of Africa with a view to resettling the entire population when the islands were underwater. The current administration has just decided to ignore it. So even in a place like that, and by the way, there's no controversy. I mean, I walked around, I asked everybody, what is your grandmother's observation, right, about, the sea level rise? I mean, it was complete, they live it. They're there every day. They understand what's happening to them. I think, these things are real. The national security aspect is real. Do we want to live in an enclave of privilege surrounded by billions of starving fellow humans on the planet? The implications are huge. But what I have to emphasize, I didn't talk about that tonight because we've heard that, it's out there, that's known. We've known it for 20 years. The exercise is to find ways to get people to connect with these truths in a way that change their own views and change the political conversation. That's the exercise that we have to do. We can't just say, if we just say over and over and over that all this bad stuff is going to happen, that isn't enough. it's not enough.
Unfortunately, we're gonna have to stop because it's almost 8 o'clock and it is quite warm in this room. I would like to just, I know Fred had a shout out here to Joseph Abate. I'd like for him to stand up, if you wouldn't mind, and give 2 seconds on what it is that you are actually doing and why it's so important. So, come on.
I really appreciate the shout out. But yeah, so I'm a student, a first year PhD student at the Plasma Physics Lab. I'm working with a student group called the New Jersey Student Climate Advocates, and we're trying to mobilize like high school students, college students, and businesses, environmental groups, and labor groups around the state to try to work on kind of a concrete, relatively local policy, a carbon pricing policy, to try to reduce emissions but protect low-income communities and also help businesses move in the future. The vision, as Fred mentioned, for us isn't just like stopping the threat of global warming. We're trying to protect ourselves against like damage. Our vision is sustainable and long-lasting jobs in the green sense and the kind of the long-lasting sense. And our vision is a great future for
Bravo!
for kids.
One more thing. So I'm Jim Waltman, the director at the Watershed Institute. If you have a high schooler at home or a grandchild who's in high school, we're hosting a great conference that's been spearheaded by Princeton Day School on May 11th. It's about climate change. This is created by high school students, for high school students. So just check that out on our website.
That's great. So thank you, Fred, so very much.